Welcome back to Chapter 2 of A Long Walk to Water. Remember what we talked about yesterday. The first part that's in bolder print here, takes place in 2008 in southern Sudan. And then quickly, after just two paragraphs, we change back to the 1985 timeline, also in southern Sudan. Okay? Remember that in 2008, we're talking about Naya, a young girl who has to go and gather water for her family, and it takes her pretty much all day to do so. And then here we have Salva's story in 1985. And so far, Salva has been in school and had to run into the bush to get away from some soldiers fighting in a civil war in Sudan. Remember that a civil war is a fight between two groups who are in the same country. Chapter 2. Naya put the container down and sat on the ground. She always tried not to step on the spiky plants that grow along the path, but their thorns littered the ground everywhere. She looked at the bottom of her foot. There it was, a big thorn that had broken off right in the middle of her heel. Naya pushed at the skin around the thorn. Then she picked up another thorn and used it to poke and prod at the first one. She pressed her lips together against the pain. See some of the things that happened as she had to walk to get the water. It's not a simple matter of walking to get the water. She has all kinds of things that can happen to her while she walks. Now moving back to 1985 with Salva. Remember, he had just run out of the school into the bush to try to get away from the fighting. Boom! Salva turned and looked. Behind him, a huge black cloud of smoke rose. Flames darted out of its base. Overhead, a jet plane veered away like a sleek, evil bird. In the smoke and dust, he couldn't see the school building anymore. He tripped and almost fell. No more looking back. It slowed him down. Salva lowered his head and ran. He ran until he could not run any more. Then he walked for hours until the sun was nearly gone from the sky. Other people were walking too. There were so many of them that they couldn't all be from the school village. They must have come from the whole area. As Salva walked, the same thoughts kept going through his head in rhythm with his steps. Where are we going? Where is my family? When will I see them again? The people stopped walking when it grew too dark to see the path. At first, everyone stood around uncertainly, speaking in tense whispers, or silent with fear. Then some of the men gathered and talked for a few moments. One of them called out, "Villages! Group yourself by villages. You will find someone you know." Salva wandered around until he heard the words, "Lunarik! The village of Lunarik here!" Relief flooded through him. That was his village. He hurried toward the sound of the voice. A dozen or so people stood in a loose group at the side of the road. Salva scanned their faces. There was no one from his family. He recognized a few people, a woman with a baby, two men, a teenage girl, but no one he knew well. Still, it was comforting to see them. They spent the night right there by the road, the men taking shifts to keep watch. The next morning they began walking again. Salva stayed in the midst of the crowd with the other villagers from Lunarik. In the early afternoon he saw a large group of soldiers up ahead. Word passed through the crowd. It's the rebels! The rebels! Those who are fighting against the government. That's who they were trying to stay away from. Salva passed several rebel soldiers waiting by the side of the road. Each of them held a big gun. Their guns were not pointed at the crowd, but even so, the soldiers seemed fierce and watchful. Some of the rebels then joined the back of the line. Now the villagers were surrounded. What are they going to do to us? Where is my family? Late in the day, the villagers arrived at the rebel camp. The soldiers ordered them into two groups, men in one group, women and children and the elderly in the other. Teenage boys, it seemed, were considered men, for boys who looked to be only a few years older than Salva were joining the men's group. Salva hesitated for a moment. He was only 11, but he was the son of an important family. He was Salva Mawane Dut Arik, from the village named for his grandfather. His father always told him to act like a man, to follow the example of his older brothers, and, in turn, set a good example for Kowal. Kowal was his younger brother. Salva took a few steps toward the men. Hey! The soldier approached Salva and raised his gun. Salva froze. All he could see was the gun's huge barrel, black and gleaming, as it moved toward his face. The end of the barrel touched his chin. Salva felt his knees turn to water. He closed his eyes. If I die now, I will never see my family again. Somehow this thought strengthened him enough to keep him from collapsing in terror. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes. The soldier was holding the gun with only one hand. He was not aiming it. He was using it to lift Salva's chin so he could get a better look at his face. Over there, the soldier said, moved the gun and pointed it toward the group of women and children. You are not a man yet. Don't be in such a hurry. He laughed and clapped Salva on the shoulder. Salva scurried over to the women's side. Salva is fortunate that he's not a man yet, because remember that the reason why the rebels took all the villagers to their village was to draft men and obviously teenage boys into their army. So if Salva had been a little bit older, he would have had to have joined their army. The next morning, the rebels moved on from the camp. The village men were forced to carry supplies, guns and mortars, shells, radio equipment. Salva watched as one man protested that he did not want to go with the rebels. A soldier hit him in the face with the butt of a gun. The man fell to the ground, bleeding. After that, no one objected. The men shouldered the heavy equipment and left the camp. Everyone else began walking again. They went in the opposite direction from the rebels, for wherever the rebels went, they were sure to be fighting. Salva stayed with the group from Lunarique. It was smaller now, without the men, and except for the infant, Salva was the only child. That evening, they found a barn in which to spend the night. Salva tossed restlessly in the itchy hay. Where are we going? Where is my family? When will I see them again? You can notice that any time there's italics like this, these are Salva's private thoughts. He doesn't say these out loud. So that's why they're not in quotation marks, but they are in italics because it's what he's thinking. It took him a long time to fall asleep. Even before he was fully awake, Salva could feel that something was wrong. He lay very still with his eyes closed, trying to sense what it might be. Finally, he sat up and opened his eyes. No one else was in the barn. Salva stood so quickly that for a moment he felt dizzy. He rushed to the door and looked out. Nobody, nothing. They had left him. He was alone. So here are some of the questions that you might have to answer for chapter 2. So we're going to quickly go over these, and I'm going to give some hints as to what might be going on. Some might be easy, some might be a little more difficult. Number 1, what does Naya's experience with a thorn tell us about her? What is a personality trait you could use to describe her based on her reaction? Remember that the thorn basically got stuck in her heel, and all she did when she felt it was she basically, sat on the ground, tried to pull it out, got another thorn, tried to pop it out. There was no complaining, there were no tears, there was none of that. So how could you describe Naya based on that reaction of simply trying to get a thorn out rather than a bunch of complaining and whining and things like that? Number 2, Linda Sue Park stated a jet plane veered away like a sleek, evil bird. What does this tell us about the plane, and what literary device is this? Now, I'm going to start with the second question. It says, what literary device is this? What they mean is what type of figurative language. So they're comparing a jet plane to a sleek, evil bird, and they're using the word like. So you should know which type of figurative language that is. As far as the first question, what does this tell us about the plane? Okay. If it veered away like a sleek, evil bird, then you can get an idea of what that plane is like. Okay. So there's your hint for that one. Number 3, what does Salva's choice to step forward on page 11 tell you about his character? Remember that the rebels had brought everyone to the village, and they separated them in 2 groups. They had set all the men on one side, and they set all the women, children, and elderly people on the other. Now, Salva thought about it for a minute, and even though he was only 11 years old, he decided that since his father had always told him to act like a man and be a good role model for his younger brother, that he should go with the men. Of course, he wasn't thinking about what the men were going to have to do if he was with the men. But the idea is that he wanted to show everyone that he was a man, even though he was only 11 years old. So explain what that tells you about Salva's character. Okay, what exactly does that say about him? And number 4, why does everyone leave Salva behind at the end of the chapter? Okay, remember that Salva had been walking with some women and older men that were too old to fight, and things like that. And except for the infant, he was the youngest child there. Now they had, I think, another teenage girl there or whatever, but most of them were women. And when he woke up in the barn the next day, everyone had left him. So you have to infer a little bit. Remember, we've done this before where we made inferences. You have to figure out, it doesn't say why they left him behind. So you have to figure it out based on the evidence. And if you go back and look at what they talked about right before they went into the barn, when they talk about, um, who's in the group, why do you think they would leave this 11-year-old boy behind? What would be the purpose of that? So those are the questions that you're probably going to have to answer. I hope that you read up until this point and that you're following along up to this point, so it'll be easier for you to answer these questions. Tomorrow, we'll read chapter 3 and find out what's going on with Naya and with Sal. All right? Take care.